I want to start with the fence, because that's where all of it actually began, not the part people usually assume. It was a Saturday in late June, the kind of heat that makes the whole block go quiet except for sprinklers, and I was standing at my workbench with the back door open, gluing a torn signature back into a hardcover somebody's grandmother had dropped in a bathtub 40 years ago. I heard music first, low, coming from the yard next door, the kind of station that plays songs older than the person listening to them. Then I looked up, the way you look up at anything unexpected, and saw her. She was lying on a towel in the grass on the other side of a fence that only came up to my chest, sunglasses on, one arm draped over her eyes, and I want to be honest and tell you, I looked longer than a polite neighbor should have looked. I told myself I was making sure the new woman next door had actually moved the sprinkler off the fence line, which was true, and also not remotely why I was still standing there 30 seconds later with a bottle of wood glue drying open in my hand. She sat up. She caught me. There is no softer way to say it. "You can help me with my back, if you're just going to stand there," she said, holding up a bottle of sunscreen without a trace of embarrassment, like she'd been waiting for exactly this excuse to talk to the guy next door who kept his back door open all day and never once said hello over the fence. "I want you to understand something about me before I go any further, because I think it explains everything that happened after that afternoon better than anything else I could tell you. I fix books for a living, not print them, not sell them, fix them. The actual broken spines and torn pages and boards that have come loose from decades of being loved too hard. I've spent 12 years learning that a book doesn't fall apart all at once. It gives a little at a time. One loosened thread, one weakened hinge, until one day somebody opens it and the whole thing comes apart in their hands, and they act surprised, even though the damage had been building for years before anybody noticed. Looking back now, I understand that Saturday was the first loosened thread in a story that took the whole summer to fall apart and come back together. At the time, I just climbed over a chest-high fence in my work apron because a woman I'd never spoken to asked me to. Let me back up, though, because you should know how we got to that fence at all. Elise moved in next door in April, a full 2 months before that afternoon, and for most of those 2 months I knew almost nothing about her except what you can learn from watching somebody unload moving boxes alone on a Tuesday. No moving crew, no family helping, a single friend who showed up twice with coffee and left both times within the hour, like she had somewhere else more important to be. I noticed these things the way I notice a hairline crack running along a spine before it splits, not because I was watching her specifically, but because I've spent so many years learning to see the places where something is under more strain than it lets on. We'd exchanged maybe 4 sentences total before that Saturday. A nod, picking up the mail. A comment about the raccoons that got into both our trash cans the same week. Nothing that could be called a conversation. I told myself I liked it that way. I'd been divorced 2 years by then, and if you'd asked me at the time, I would have told you I liked my quiet, empty house and my quiet, empty evenings, and I would have believed every word of it while I said it. I climbed the fence that Saturday and rubbed sunscreen into a stranger's shoulders, with my hands still faintly smelling of wood glue, and neither of us said much of anything while I did it, which felt, at the time, less awkward than it probably should have. Her skin was warm under my palms, sun-heated, and I remember being surprised at how ordinary the whole thing felt within about 10 seconds, like some part of me had been waiting for exactly this kind of unremarkable, uncomplicated touch for longer than I'd let myself notice. When I finished, she thanked me, put her sunglasses back down over her eyes, and said, without looking at me, "You're the book guy. Diego mentioned you. Diego talks about me. Diego talks about everyone. He told me you fixed his grandmother's Bible. Said you cried a little when you handed it back to her." I didn't cry. That's not what Diego says. I want to tell you that I laughed, and that the laugh surprised me, because it was the first time in longer than I wanted to admit that something had come out of me easily, without a beat of hesitation first. I sat down on the grass a few feet from her towel, not invited exactly, but not told to leave either. And we talked for the better part of an hour about nothing that mattered, her old apartment in the city, the noise of the highway she didn't miss, a dog she'd always wanted and never gotten around to. She didn't mention a husband. I didn't ask. Looking back now, I understand that not asking was its own kind of choice. The first of several I made that summer without letting myself notice I was making them. There were 3 things about her that afternoon I filed away without understanding why. 3 details that meant nothing on their own, and everything once I finally understood the shape of the whole picture. The first was the book. It was sitting on the grass beside her towel, spine up, pages splayed open in a way that would have made me wince on principle, even before I knew her. A worn paperback with a cracked spine held together in places with yellowed tape somebody had applied badly a long time ago. I asked about it out of habit more than curiosity. "My mother's," she said. "She used to read it to me every summer we came out to the lake. I've had it repaired twice by people who didn't know what they were doing, and I keep telling myself I'll find someone who actually does, and then I don't, because it feels like admitting I've let it fall apart on my watch." I told her, without thinking too hard about the offer, that I could fix it properly if she ever wanted, and she looked at me for a second longer than the moment required. The way you look at someone deciding whether an offer is real or just something people say. "I might take you up on that," she said, and didn't hand it over that day, which I understood later meant more than it seemed to at the time. The second thing was her phone. It buzzed twice while we sat there, and both times she glanced at the screen, went very still for half a second, and then turned it face down in the grass without answering, without even reading past whatever the first line of the text had shown her. I didn't ask about that either. I had learned, in 2 years of living alone after a marriage that ended quietly instead of loudly, that some silences are a kindness and some silences are a wall, and I hadn't yet learned to tell the two apart in a woman I'd known for one afternoon. The third thing was smaller than the other 2, and I almost didn't notice it at all. When she finally stood up to go back inside, brushing grass off her legs, she paused at her own back door and looked, just for a second, up and down the street, both directions, slow, deliberate, the kind of look you give a road before you cross it when you already have a reason to expect traffic. Then she went inside, and I climbed back over the fence into my own yard, and I didn't think much more about any of it. Not that day. I want to tell you what my house looked like in those 2 months before that Saturday, because I think it matters, the way an empty room says something a full one never could. I bought it 18 months after the divorce, a smaller place than the one Rachel and I had shared, on a street with more trees than people, and I'd told myself at the time that smaller meant simpler, that simpler meant easier, that I'd finally learned my lesson about building a life around somebody else's expectations of what my life should look like. What I didn't tell myself, not for a long time, was that Rachel had left because I'd made a habit, over 11 years of marriage, of leaving first, in every way that mattered except the actual moving out. I went quiet when things got hard. I found reasons to work late, reasons to stay in the shop past closing, reasons to be anywhere except in a room where an actual conversation might happen. She used to say I loved broken things because I could fix them without them ever needing anything back from me. I used to tell her that wasn't fair. Looking back now, I understand it was the fairest thing anyone ever said about me, and I just wasn't ready to hear it yet. Diego, who ran the shop 2 doors down from mine and had known me since before the divorce, used to tell me I'd turned my whole life into a bindery, everything broken, carefully repaired, kept at arm's length, admired instead of lived with. He said it more than once, usually over coffee on a slow Tuesday, usually followed by some version of the same joke, that I was going to die alone, surrounded by other people's memories, having never built any of my own. "You ever going to talk to the woman next door?" he asked me, the Monday after that Saturday, leaning against my counter with a coffee he hadn't paid for. I helped her put sunscreen on. That's talking, technically. Diego looked at me for a long moment, the particular look he gave me whenever he thought I was about to do the thing I always did, find a reason to close the door before it had a chance to open all the way. "That's not talking," he said. "That's you, standing very still while something happens near you. There's a difference. And you've been getting away with confusing the two for about as long as I've known you." I didn't have a good answer for that. So I didn't give him one, and he let it go the way he usually did, because Diego had learned a long time ago that pushing me only made me dig in harder, and that the only thing that ever actually moved me was time, and circumstance, and something happening that I couldn't find a reason to stand still through. Elise came by the shop for the first time on a Wednesday, 10 days after the fence, the book from the lake finally in her hands, wrapped in a dish towel like she was smuggling something fragile across a border. She stood in the doorway a moment before coming in, the way people do when they're about to hand something over that matters more than they want to admit out loud. "I keep almost bringing this in," she said, and then finding a reason not to. "I just ran out of reasons." She set it on the counter between us, gentle, both hands, the way you'd hand over something living. Her name was written in the front once. My mother's. Somebody's coffee ruined the page years ago, before I even had it. I can't read her name anymore. I know it's there. I just can't read it. I opened the front cover carefully, and there it was, exactly what she'd described. A brown ring of old coffee blooming across the end paper, swallowing whatever had been written in pen beneath it. I told her I couldn't promise to bring the name back, that some damage goes past what any repair can undo, but that I could stabilize the spine, re-sew what had come loose, make it something she could open 100 more times without losing another page. "That's more than the other two guys promised," she said. "They just wanted to tape it and charge me for tape." I told her it would take about 3 weeks, longer than most jobs, because a book like that deserved slow hands instead of fast ones, and she nodded like that made sense to her in a way most things hadn't lately. And on her way out the door, she turned back once, hand on the frame, and said, almost like she was testing how it sounded out loud, "Diego was right about the crying thing, by the way." I could tell, standing here. You get a certain look. I didn't argue with her. I've come to understand, since, that some accusations are worth just letting land. It was another 8 days before I learned the name of the man whose car I'd started noticing, parked at the far curb some evenings, engine still running, headlights pointed at her house for 10-15 minutes at a time before pulling away without anyone ever getting out. I noticed it the way I notice a hinge that's begun to squeak before it fails completely. A small wrongness easy to explain away, easy to tell yourself is nothing, right up until the day it very much is. Before that, though, there were 3 good weeks. I think it's important I tell you about those weeks properly, because everything that came later only means what it means against the backdrop of how easy that summer became, how ordinary, in the best sense of the word. Elise started walking over most evenings after the book landed on my bench, at first with some excuse, checking on its progress, dropping off a second book she'd found in a box she hadn't finished unpacking, and then, somewhere around the 2nd week, without any excuse at all, just a knock on the frame of my open back door around 7, asking if I wanted company while I worked. I said yes every time. I want that on the record, because there were years in my marriage where I would have found a reason to say I was too busy, too tired, too deep into a project to be interrupted, and I never once said any of that to her, not once that whole summer. She'd sit on the stool across the bench and watch me work, asking questions that weren't really about bookbinding at all, why I'd chosen it, what I'd done before, whether I missed anything about the life I'd had before the divorce. I found myself answering honestly, more honestly than I answered most people, telling her about the 11 years with Rachel, about the way I used to disappear into projects instead of arguments, about the quiet that had ended my marriage instead of any single dramatic failure. She listened the way you listen to somebody when you've decided their answer actually matters to you, not just filling silence, and somewhere in the middle of one of those evenings, I realized I'd told her more about myself in 2 weeks than I'd told most people in years. She didn't offer the same back. I noticed that too, filed it away next to the phone turned face down in the grass, next to the look up and down the street before she went inside. She'd redirect, gently, skillfully, in a way that took me longer than it should have to recognize as a pattern instead of coincidence. Ask me something else about a repair technique, laugh at something Diego had said that morning, change the subject with enough warmth that you almost didn't notice the subject had changed at all. Mrs. Alcott, who'd lived on the other side of Elise's house for as long as anyone on the block could remember, caught me at my mailbox one morning in early July and told me, without much preamble, that she was glad somebody was finally keeping that girl company. "She's too quiet for a woman that young," Mrs. Alcott said, adjusting the visor she wore even to walk 20 feet to her own mailbox. First few weeks she moved in, I'd see a car outside some nights. Sitting there a good while, haven't seen it in a couple weeks now, which I take as a good sign, though I couldn't tell you what it means exactly. She looked at me over the top of her sunglasses, the particular look older women on quiet streets seemed to specialize in, equal parts curiosity and warning. "You're good for her. I can see it already. Just don't be the kind of good that disappears the second something gets complicated. I've seen your kind before, dear. Quiet men make wonderful company right up until the moment they're needed for something harder than company." I told her I wasn't planning on disappearing anywhere, and she gave me a look that suggested she'd heard that sentence from plenty of men before me who'd meant it just as much when they said it. The book came together slowly, the way a proper repair always does. I resewed the loosened signatures one at a time, replaced the crumbling mull along the spine, rebuilt the hinge so it would open flat without straining the boards the way it had been straining for years under bad tape and worse intentions. I didn't touch the coffee stain on the end paper. Some damage isn't mine to erase, only to work around carefully enough that it stops spreading. Somewhere in the middle of those 3 weeks, on a Sunday when neither of us had anywhere else to be, Elise showed up at my back door around 6 with a paper bag of takeout and a 6-pack of the kind of beer neither of us actually liked, and told me she'd decided we were having dinner in my yard whether I'd agreed to it or not. We ate sitting on the same patch of grass where I'd rubbed sunscreen into her shoulders a month earlier, the fence between our two properties looking, that evening, less like a boundary and more like something we'd both quietly stopped needing. She told me more that night than she had in the 3 weeks before it combined. Not about the man in the car, not yet, but about her mother, about the lake house the book had come from, about a childhood spent moving twice a year for a father's job, until she'd sworn to herself she'd plant one house somewhere and never leave it again. I told her about learning bookbinding from a woman named Marion who ran the shop before I bought it from her, about the strange satisfaction of a spine that finally lies flat after months of stubborn resistance, about how Rachel used to say I loved a project more than I loved people, because a project never left you confused about where you stood. "Do you think that's still true?" Elise asked, turning a beer bottle slowly in her hand, a habit she seemed to have whenever she was thinking hard about something bigger than the conversation actually happening. "That you love a project more than a person." I used to think it was true. I've been wondering lately if it was just easier to believe than the alternative. What's the alternative? That I loved people, fine. I was just scared of what it cost to actually stay in the room once it got hard. I looked at her for a second, surprised at my own honesty, the kind that usually took me months to work up to, and had, that night, come out of me in under a minute. "I'm working on it." She smiled at that, a real one, and didn't push further. And we sat out there until the mosquitoes finally ran us both inside, and I remember standing at my own back door after she'd gone home, watching the light go on in her kitchen window across the yard, thinking that I hadn't felt this specific kind of unguarded in longer than I could easily remember, and that some part of me was already afraid of exactly how much that was starting to matter. Elise came by on a Thursday evening near the end of July, 3 weeks almost exactly from the day she'd first carried it in wrapped in a dish towel, and I set it on the bench between us, finished, The spine straight and true, the pages finally lying flat, the way they were meant to from the beginning. She opened it slowly, turned to the front, ran her thumb over the coffee stain where her mother's name used to be legible, and didn't say anything for a long moment. "I can't read it," she said finally, quiet. "Even now, even fixed. I told you I couldn't bring that part back." "I know. I just thought maybe, once everything else was right again, I'd be able to see it anyway, like it would come back on its own, if the rest of the book finally held together." She closed it gently, held it against her chest, the way you hold something you're not ready to set down yet. "That's a stupid thing to have hoped for." "It's not stupid," I said. "I think it's the whole reason people bring me broken things instead of just buying new ones. Some part of everybody's hoping the fix brings back more than what was actually lost." She looked at me for a long moment then, in a way she hadn't looked at me before. Not across the fence, not on the stool by my bench, something steadier and more direct, like she was finally deciding whether to hand me something else besides a book. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "And you don't ask me to explain all of it tonight, because I don't think I'm ready to explain all of it tonight." I told her she could. "I'm not divorced yet," she said. "I know I've let you assume things. I know I've let this whole street assume things. It's complicated, and it's not close to finished, and some nights I still don't sleep because of how unfinished it is." She looked down at the book in her hands instead of at me. "I wanted you to hear that from me before you heard it some other way. I don't know why it matters to me so much that you hear it first. It just does." I didn't say anything right away. I thought about the car with its engine running at the far curb, the phone turned face down in the grass, the long, careful look up and down the street before she went inside her own house. I thought about 11 years of my own life spent going quiet at exactly the moment somebody needed me to stay present. And I understood. Standing there in my shop with sawdust and glue on the counter between us, that I had a choice in front of me that I hadn't had to make in a very long time. The choice between reaching for the easy exit or staying still enough to find out what came next. "Thank you for telling me first," I said, which wasn't much of an answer, but it was true, and it was enough. For that night, to make her exhale like she'd been holding her breath since she walked in the door. She left a few minutes later, the book held against her chest, and I stood in my shop a long while after she'd gone, looking at the empty stool across the bench, thinking about the way Mrs. Alcott had looked at me over her sunglasses. Quiet men make wonderful company right up until the moment they're needed for something harder than company, and wondering, for the first time in 2 years, whether I was finally ready to find out if that was still true of me. I locked up later than usual that night, running my thumb once over the spine of the book before I remembered it wasn't mine to keep, and walked home under a sky that still held a little orange along the tree line, past her dark kitchen window, past the empty curb where no car sat waiting, and told myself, the way you tell yourself things you badly want to be true, that the quiet on that street meant exactly what it looked like it meant. It was 3 days later that the car showed up parked directly in front of my own house instead of hers, and a man I'd never met got out of it and walked up my driveway like he already knew exactly who I was. His name was Marcus, and he told me so himself, standing in my own driveway like he'd been invited, hands in his pockets, a posture that read as relaxed to anyone who hadn't already spent 3 weeks learning to notice the difference between relaxed and controlled. "You're the neighbor," he said. Not a question. "The book guy." "That's me. I hear you've been spending a lot of time with my wife." He said the word wife with a particular weight to it, the kind of weight a man puts on a word when he's using it as a fact and a warning at the same time. I wanted to come introduce myself before this got any further along, since it seems like nobody bothered to fill you in properly. I want to tell you exactly how I felt standing there, because I think it matters for everything that came after. I didn't feel afraid of him. Not exactly. Though something in the careful stillness of his posture put me on guard, the way I go on guard around a spine that looks fine on the outside but gives, ever so slightly, the wrong way when you press on it. What I felt, mostly, was a familiar, unwelcome pull toward the exit. Some old, well-worn part of me wanted to nod, wish him well, go back inside, let two strangers sort out whatever was actually between them without getting any further involved. I want you to remember that impulse, because it came back more than once that summer, and I didn't always manage to ignore it as cleanly as I did that first afternoon. I think if there's something I need to know, I said, it should probably come from her. Something flickered across his face, brief, gone almost before I registered it. That's a nice sentiment, real respectful. She's good at getting men to feel respectful right up until they figure out what they've actually signed up for. He looked past me, toward my open garage, my workbench visible through the door, the half-finished spine of somebody's paperback clamped in a press. She tell you about the money yet? The house that isn't fully hers to sell? The reason this divorce has dragged on 14 months instead of 6? I think you should leave. I think you should ask better questions before you climb any more fences. He said it lightly, almost pleasantly, which somehow made it land harder than if he'd shouted it. And then he turned and walked back to his car without waiting for a response, and pulled away from the curb, slow, unhurried, a man who had said exactly what he came to say and felt no need to rush the exit. I didn't tell Elise about it that day. I want to be honest about that, because I think it's the first real test of everything I'd told her under that fence about working on it, and I failed it quietly, the way I'd failed most tests like it for most of my adult life. I told myself I was protecting her from having to relive whatever conversation that was. I told myself it wasn't my place to bring trouble to her door that she hadn't asked me to carry. Looking back now, I understand both of those reasons were true and also, at the same time, the same old habit wearing a slightly more flattering coat. Diego noticed something was off within the hour. He always did. "You look like a man who got told something he didn't want to hear," he said. When I came by the shop that afternoon to pick up a box of buckram I'd ordered, Elise's husband stopped by my house. Diego set down the coffee he was drinking, which for Diego was the equivalent of anyone else standing up and turning off the television. "And you're telling me this now, an hour later, instead of the second it happened, because I don't know what to do with it yet." "You know exactly what to do with it," you tell her. Today, before he tells her his version of the conversation first, and you're playing catch-up in your own story. Diego shook his head, not unkindly, the way you shake your head at a friend making the same mistake you've watched him make for years. "This is the part, man. This is the exact part where you usually go quiet and let the silence do the deciding for you. I've watched you do it for a decade. Don't do it this time." I told him I wouldn't. I told myself the same thing on the walk back to my own shop, and I believed it right up until the moment I actually had the chance to knock on Elise's door that evening and found myself, instead, standing very still in my own kitchen, telling myself there'd be a better time, a calmer version of this conversation, some evening that wasn't already tired and complicated enough without adding Marcus's name to it. I didn't tell her for 4 more days. In those 4 days, small things kept happening, small enough that I could have talked myself out of noticing any one of them on its own, and together they built into something I couldn't keep pretending was nothing. A folded note under her windshield wiper that she balled up fast and shoved in her pocket without reading it all the way, her jaw tight for the rest of that afternoon. A missed call log on her phone, 7 calls in one evening from the same number, that she showed me without my asking, like she needed someone else to see the number of times. 7, laid out plainly instead of carried alone. Mrs. Alcott at the mailbox again, telling me she'd seen a man walking slow circles around the block twice that week, not stopping anywhere, just walking, the kind of walking that isn't really about getting anywhere. I watched Elise change in small ways over those 4 days too, ways I don't think she noticed herself changing. She started parking her car closer to her front door instead of in the driveway proper. She stopped leaving her back door open the way she had all July, the way that had let her wander over to my shop on a whim without either of us treating it as an event. She flinched Once, at the sound of a car backfiring 2 streets over, a full-body flinch that lasted only a second before she covered it with a small, apologetic laugh. And I understood, watching that half-second, that whatever Marcus had actually done to her over 14 years had left something in her body that no amount of new safety could immediately talk out of being afraid. It was Mrs. Alcott who finally pushed me past my own hesitation on the 5th morning, catching me before I'd even made it to my own driveway. "You know something you haven't told her," she said. No preamble at all. The visor pushed back on her head like she'd come out specifically for this and didn't want to waste time on smaller talk first. "I can see it on you. You've got the same look my late husband used to get, right before he decided not to tell me something for my own good, which, in 40 years of marriage, was never once actually for my own good. It was always for his own comfort. Don't confuse those two things, dear. They wear the same face, but they aren't the same animal." I told her about Marcus that same afternoon, sitting on the same patch of grass where the whole summer had started, and I watched her face change while I talked, the particular stillness that meant she was deciding how much of what I was telling her she already knew and hadn't said, and how much was genuinely new. "He came to your house," she repeated, quiet. When I'd finished. "5 days ago. I should have told you the same day. I don't have a good reason I didn't, except the reason I'm working on, which apparently isn't as fixed as I thought it was." She was quiet a long moment, picking at a blade of grass, and when she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of the ease it usually carried around me. "He does this," she said. "Not exactly this, not always the driveway version, but this. Finds the person I've let get close and makes sure they hear his side of things before they've had a chance to hear mine. He did it to my sister. First year we were married. Told her I was struggling with things I wasn't struggling with, planted enough doubt that she stopped calling as much, and by the time I figured out what he'd done, we'd already lost 2 years of closeness I never fully got back." She looked at me, steady, the same directness from the night she'd handed me the finished book. "I'm not going to tell you the whole story today. I will tell you it's worse than what he probably implied, and better than what you might be imagining right now, because it wasn't the kind of marriage where anything dramatic happened all at once. It was 14 years of things happening a little at a time, until one day I looked around and didn't recognize the size of the life I was allowed to have anymore. I thought about my own 11 years with Rachel, about a very different kind of shrinking, mine caused by my own silence instead of anyone else's control. And I understood, sitting there, that we were each carrying a version of the same wound shaped by opposite mistakes, hers a husband who took up too much space and left her none. Mine a husband, myself, who took up too little and left his wife alone in a room that should have held 2 people. "He's not going to sign the papers easily," Elise said. "He's contesting almost everything. The house. The car. He's telling people I'm unstable, that I left without warning, that I'm punishing him for reasons that don't make sense. Some of them believe him. It's easier to believe the version of the story that doesn't require anybody to look too closely at 14 years they didn't notice anything wrong in either." I asked her, carefully, what she needed from me, and she looked at me for a long moment before she answered. "I need you to not disappear the second this gets harder than sunscreen and book repairs," she said. "That's all. I've had enough people find a reason to step back once they realized this wasn't a simple story. I don't need you to fix it. I need you to stay in the room." I told her I would, and I meant it more fully than I'd meant almost anything I'd said to another person, in longer than I wanted to count, and for a week and a half after that, it seemed like meaning it might actually be enough. Those 10 days were some of the best of that whole summer, and I want to tell you about at least one of them properly, because I think the story loses something important if all you hear about is the trouble. We went to the county fair on a Tuesday night, both of us playing hooky from our own shops for a few hours, and she won a stuffed rabbit at a ring toss booth she swore was rigged and handed it to me instead of keeping it. said I needed something soft in a workshop full of clamps and glue presses. We ate funnel cake standing up because neither of us wanted to sit down and end the evening any sooner than it had to end. Walking back to the car, she reached over and took my hand without any ceremony about it, like it was the most natural next thing in the world. And I remember thinking, with the particular clarity that only comes to you a few times in a life, that I had not felt this specific kind of uncomplicated happiness in longer than I'd let myself admit, maybe longer than my entire marriage had actually contained. I kissed her for the first time 2 nights later. On my own back porch, the fence between our yards, standing there in the dark like a thing we'd both agreed to stop needing weeks earlier, and she kissed me back like she'd been waiting for me to be the one to close that last distance instead of her, which, looking back now, I understand was exactly the case. She'd spent 14 years with a man who closed distances for her, whether she wanted them closed or not. I think some part of her needed to know I'd wait for my turn, instead of assuming I was owed it. It wasn't enough. Not entirely. Not for as long as I wanted it to be. Marcus started showing up more often after that, never quite crossing into something I could call the police about, always careful to stay on the correct side of whatever line the law drew, which somehow made it worse instead of better. His car at the curb again, more frequently now, sometimes just for a few minutes, sometimes for an hour. A second note on her windshield, this one she let me read, 3 sentences that on paper looked almost reasonable, and that I understood. Reading between them, the way you learn to read the tension in a damaged spine, were built entirely to make her doubt herself instead of him. I found myself, some evenings, sitting at my own kitchen table instead of walking over, telling myself I was giving her space, telling myself I didn't want to make things more complicated by being visibly present every single time Marcus decided to make his presence felt. I want to be honest that some of those evenings, the space I was giving her had less to do with her and more to do with me. The old instinct rising back up, dressed as consideration, finding smaller and smaller reasons to be somewhere else when things felt too much like the beginning of a conversation I didn't know how to finish. My mother called during one of those evenings, near the middle of August, one of her twice-a-month check-ins that usually lasted 10 minutes and covered nothing more complicated than the weather and her garden. That night, for reasons I still don't fully understand, I told her about Elise, about Marcus, about the note on the windshield, and my mother went quiet on the other end of the line in a way she rarely did. "Your father used to park outside places," she said finally, careful, like she was handling something with a hairline crack of her own. "Not often, a few times, early on, before I made it clear I wasn't going to have a marriage built that way. I never told you that. I don't know why I'm telling you now, except that you sound like a man trying to decide whether staying present is worth the discomfort of it, and I want you to know it is. It always was. I just wish somebody had told me that sooner than I figured it out myself." I sat with that for a moment, the phone warm against my ear, my whole childhood quietly rearranging itself around one sentence I hadn't been expecting. "Why didn't you ever tell me any of that?" I asked. "Because by the time you were old enough to ask good questions about it, it had stopped being true, and I didn't see the use in handing you a version of your father that wasn't the man who actually raised to you." She was quiet a second. I wonder now if that was the right call. Silence has a way of teaching its own lesson, whether you mean it to or not. I think you learned mine a little too well. I hadn't known that about my father, not that specific detail, though I'd always known there was a hardness in him that softened only after I turned 12 or so, a shift my mother had never fully explained and I'd never fully asked about. I sat with that new piece of information a long while after we hung up, turning it over the way Elise turned over a beer bottle when she was thinking hard about something bigger than what was directly in front of her. And I understood, for the first time, that my own habit of going quiet under pressure hadn't come from nowhere. I'd learned it watching a house where staying quiet was sometimes the only way anyone found any peace at all, and I'd carried that lesson into a marriage where it had done the opposite of protect anyone. The night everything finally broke open was a Friday. 3 weeks into August. Hot enough that half the block had their windows open, which is the only reason I heard it as clearly as I did. I was at my own kitchen table when the shouting started next door. Marcus's voice first, raised in a way I hadn't heard from him yet, something about papers, about lawyers, about her making him look unstable in front of people who mattered to his career. I was out my own back door and over the fence before I'd fully decided to go. The same fence, the same chest-high wood I'd climbed in June for an entirely different reason. I found them on her front porch. Marcus standing too close, his voice pitched low now, instead of loud, which somehow read as more dangerous than the shouting had, and Elise, standing very still against her own front door, arms crossed tight over her chest, not backing down, not moving, holding her ground in a way that told me this wasn't the first time she'd had to find that particular stillness inside herself. "You don't get to do this anymore," she was saying, as I came around the side of the house. "You don't get to show up here and tell me who I'm allowed to be seen with. That ended the night I left, Marcus. I don't care how many notes you leave, how many times you park out there hoping I'll flinch. I'm done flinching." Marcus turned when he heard me, and for a second something crossed his face that looked almost like relief, like he'd been waiting for exactly this kind of audience the whole time. "There he is," Marcus said. "Right on cue. You know she does this. Waits until I'm here, makes sure somebody's watching, so whatever she says next sounds braver than it actually is." "I think you should go," I said, and I kept my voice level. "The way you keep your hands steady over a spine that's under too much pressure and about to give." "You think," Marcus repeated, and laughed. Short, humorless. "You've known her 3 months. I was married to her for 14 years. You don't get to stand on her porch and tell me what I think I know about my own wife." "She's not your wife anymore," I said. "Not in any way that matters. And whatever happened in those 14 years, this isn't a version of it you get to keep having. Out here, in front of her neighbors, at 11 o'clock at night." Something in his face shifted then, the careful control finally cracking around the edges, and for one long second I genuinely didn't know which way it was going to break. It broke toward retreat, not violence, though I understood, watching him, that the two had probably been close enough together in that marriage that Elise had learned to prepare for both, every single time. "This isn't over," Marcus said, backing off the porch, pointing a finger somewhere between the two of us, not quite at either. "You have no idea what you're standing in the middle of. Neither of you does. I'll see you both in court, and we'll see how brave this looks with lawyers involved instead of a book guy playing hero on a Friday night." He got in his car and pulled away fast this time. No careful, unhurried exit. Tires loud enough that a light came on in Mrs. Alcott's front window, and Elise and I stood on that porch a long moment after his taillights disappeared. Neither of us saying anything at first, both of us breathing harder than the situation had physically required. "That wasn't the first time," she said finally, quiet, not looking at me. "It's been building for weeks. I didn't want to tell you how bad it had gotten because I didn't want to watch you decide this was more than you'd signed up for." I understood, standing there, that whatever had just happened, whatever Marcus had threatened on his way out, wasn't finished. Not by a long stretch. And that the easy summer we'd had, the fence and the sunscreen, and the slow evenings in my shop, had just cracked open into something with real weight behind it. The kind of weight that would either hold us both up or prove, finally, whether I was actually a different man than the one who used to go quiet the moment a marriage asked something hard of him. Mrs. Alcott came out onto her own porch a few minutes later, robe pulled tight, and didn't say much beyond asking if we were both all right. But she stood with us a while in the dark anyway, the three of us on that porch like a small, tired defense line, until the street had gone quiet enough that Elise finally convinced her to go back inside and try to sleep. I stayed until almost 2 in the morning, sitting with Elise at her kitchen table while she made 2 cups of tea neither of us drank, both of us too wired to sleep and too tired to talk much beyond the occasional necessary sentence. Somewhere around 1, She finally told me the shape of the 14 years Marcus had only implied at, not every detail, not that night, but enough. The way he'd slowly cut her off from friends who asked too many questions. The way arguments always somehow became about what she'd done wrong to cause them. The way she'd started keeping a small folder of her own, receipts and screenshots and dates, not because she'd known she was going to leave, but because some quiet, self-protective part of her had started building a case long before the rest of her caught up and admitted why. The consequence of that Friday night arrived 4 days later, in the form of a certified letter that showed up at my own address, not hers, from a lawyer I'd never heard of, informing me that I had been named as a person of interest in the ongoing divorce proceedings. That my conduct on the evening in question had been characterized in a filing as aggressive and unprovoked, and that I should expect to be contacted regarding a deposition if the matter proceeded further. I read it twice, standing in my own driveway, in almost the same spot where Marcus had first introduced himself 2.5 weeks earlier, and felt something cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with fear for myself and everything to do with understanding, all at once. That this wasn't a story that was going to resolve itself with one dramatic porch confrontation and a quiet walk home. Marcus wasn't finished. He'd found a way to make my presence in Elise's life into a weapon he could point back at her, evidence, in whatever version of events he was building, that she was the one destabilizing things, that she was the one who'd brought a stranger into a conflict that should have stayed contained between the two of them. I hadn't told Elise about the letter yet. I want that on the record too. The same way I told you about the 4 days I didn't tell her about Marcus showing up at my house, because I think it matters that this pattern in me hadn't fully broken just because I wanted it to. Some habits don't dissolve the moment you decide to be a different man. They just get quieter and wait for the next good excuse to resurface. And I was standing in my driveway with a lawyer's letter in my hand, already halfway through composing the reasons I might have for keeping this one to myself a little longer, when I heard her car pull into her own driveway next door, and understood I had about 30 seconds to decide, again, which kind of man I was actually going to be. I folded the letter once, twice, until it fit in my back pocket, and I walked toward the sound of her car door closing, telling myself, with as much conviction as I could manage on short notice, that whatever came next, I was at least going to walk toward it, instead of standing very still and letting it happen near me the way I always used to. I gave her the letter before she'd even set her keys down on the counter. I want to tell you that decision came easily, that all my talk about being a different kind of man translated cleanly into action the second it mattered. It didn't come easily. It came with my hand actually shaking a little as I pulled it out of my back pocket. And it came because I'd made myself a promise walking across that driveway, and because some things only count if you do them at the exact moment they're hardest, not the moment they're convenient. Elise read it, standing in her own kitchen, and I watched her face do something complicated. Anger first, and then something closer to exhaustion, the particular exhaustion of a person watching a familiar shape reassemble itself in a new room. "He's using you," she said, when she finished. "This is exactly what he did with my sister, except now he's got a piece of paper to make it official. He'll drag this out for months if it gets him what he wants, which isn't actually winning. It's just making sure I never get to feel like this is finished. I'm not going anywhere because of a letter. I know. You believe that right now." She set the letter down on the counter. Careful, the way you set down something you don't want to look at anymore but also can't quite make yourself throw away. But I've watched good intentions get worn down before. Not because the person didn't mean them, because 14 months of legal pressure is a very long time to keep believing something is worth the cost of it. I understood, standing there, that we'd arrived at the part of the story where the easy summer officially ended, and something harder began, the part where staying present wasn't going to be a single dramatic gesture on a porch at midnight, but 100 smaller, less cinematic choices, most of which nobody but the two of us would ever know I'd made. 3 days after the letter, Elise pulled back, not the way she had once before, not quiet and careful and asking for a little time, This time it came sharper, more decided, and I understood, the moment she said it, that this version scared me more than Marcus's driveway visit ever had. "I think we should slow down," she said, standing on her own front steps. Arms crossed the same way they'd been crossed the night Marcus showed up, except this time the person she was holding herself against was me. "Not because of you. Because of what this is costing you. Depositions, lawyers, a stranger's name on a filing because you happen to be kind to your neighbor. I didn't ask for any of that to land on you, and I don't know how to keep watching it happen without feeling like I'm the reason your whole life is getting more complicated. You didn't do this to me. He did, I know that." Knowing it doesn't make it easier to watch. She looked away, out toward the street, toward the empty curb where his car wasn't parked that morning, and I understood she was picturing it there anyway, the way you picture a wound even after the bandage is on. "I need some time to figure out how to fight this without dragging you further into it. That's not me pushing you away because I don't want this. It's me trying to protect the one good thing that's happened this year from getting buried under everything else. I want to be honest about how that landed. It landed like the exact permission my old habits had been waiting for. A clean, reasonable, even generous excuse to step back, ease off, let her handle her own fight the way some quiet, well-worn part of me had wanted to let Marcus handle his own conversation with her back in June. I felt that pull, strong, familiar, dressed this time in the kindest possible packaging, protect her by leaving her alone. I didn't take it. I want that clearly stated, because I think it's the actual hinge point of this whole story, more than the porch, more than the letter. I told her I understood why she wanted space, and that I'd give her exactly as much as she asked for, but that giving her space and disappearing weren't the same thing, and I intended to keep proving the difference for as long as it took her to believe it. "How?" she asked, not unkindly, more like she genuinely wanted the mechanics of it, like she'd never actually been shown what that looked like from the inside of a relationship instead of just hearing men promise it before they left anyway. "I don't know exactly," I admitted. "I've never been the version of myself that stays through the hard part before. I'm figuring it out as I go, same as you are. But I can tell you what it's not going to look like. It's not going to look like me pretending I understand if you go quiet on me for a week. It's not going to look like me waiting for you to come find me first every single time. I'll give you room. I won't give you silence dressed up as room. Those are different things, and I've spent most of my adult life confusing them, so I'm paying closer attention to the difference now than I probably ever have to anything." She studied me for a long moment on those front steps, the same, steady, assessing look I'd first noticed in her the day she'd handed me the book wrapped in a dish towel, and something in her face softened, just slightly, though she didn't take back the request for space, and I didn't ask her to. We didn't talk much for the better part of a week after that. I kept working. I fixed 3 books that didn't need me nearly as much as I needed them, that week, to keep my hands busy while the rest of me waited. Diego didn't say much either, which for Diego was its own kind of support, just showing up at my shop most afternoons with 2 coffees instead of 1, setting the second one down without comment, letting me talk when I wanted to and staying quiet when I didn't. On the 4th day of that week, I nearly broke my own rule. I stood at my back door around 7 in the evening, the exact hour Elise used to knock on the frame without any excuse at all, and told myself a text wouldn't count as pushing, that checking in wasn't the same as crowding her, and I had my phone in my hand composing 3 different versions of the same message before I finally set it down and made myself sit with the discomfort instead of solving it. It was, I think, the first time in my adult life I'd chosen to feel uncertain on purpose instead of doing something, anything, to make the uncertainty stop. It didn't feel good. It felt necessary, which I was slowly learning were not always the same thing either. She knocked on my door herself on the 6th evening, not the back door, the front, which felt significant in a way I couldn't fully explain, and stood there a moment before saying anything at all. "I missed the sound of the glue press," she said finally, which wasn't really what either of us meant, and both of us understood that. And I stepped back to let her in, and neither of us mentioned the week directly again, though something about it had clearly settled something in both of us that hadn't been settled before. It was Mrs. Alcott who called Elise's aunt, a woman named Josephine who I'd never met and Elise rarely mentioned, and it was Josephine, during a visit that following weekend, who told me something about Elise's mother that reframed the whole summer in a way I hadn't seen coming. I only overheard part of it, sitting on my own back porch, while their voices carried faintly over the fence, Josephine's unfamiliar and a little sharper than Elise's, telling a version of a story I hadn't known existed. Elise's mother, it turned out, had left her father, when Elise was 9 years old, quietly, in the middle of the night, taking almost nothing with her, and the family had spent the following 20 years calling her unstable, calling her selfish, building a version of events that let everyone avoid asking what she might have actually been leaving. "She used to leave notes," I heard Josephine say, her voice carrying clearer for a moment, as she must have moved closer to the fence. "Little things, tucked in drawers, in the lining of coats. Your mother left me one once, years after, that just said she was sorry she couldn't explain it to a 9-year-old in a way that wouldn't make you hate your father. I didn't understand it at the time. I understand it a great deal better now, watching you." "Why did nobody ever tell me any of that?" Elise asked, her voice tight in a way I recognized from the porch a month earlier. "Because it was easier for this family to have a villain who left than to sit with the truth that we all should have asked better questions while she was still around to answer them. Your grandmother started that story, and the rest of us kept telling it because it was simpler than the alternative, which was admitting we'd failed her." Josephine was quiet a moment. "I'm not proud of that. I don't think anyone left in this family is." Watching you almost repeat the exact same silence with Marcus, watching you almost let this new man walk away out of the same instinct to protect everyone but yourself, that's what finally made me pick up the phone and say something instead of keeping the family peace one more time. I understood, hearing that much through an open window, why the coffee stain on that end paper had felt like more than an accident to Elise, why she'd carried a book with an unreadable name in it for years, instead of letting it go, why some part of her had needed the whole object restored before she'd let herself hope the name underneath might somehow come back too. Some silences get passed down whether anyone means them to or not. The same way my father's had gotten passed down to me, and Elise had been carrying her mother's erased name in her chest a long time before she ever carried the actual book into my shop. Elise came over that evening, quieter than usual, and told me most of what Josephine had said, filling in pieces I hadn't caught through the fence, and somewhere in the telling of it I watched something shift in her face, a kind of grief arriving late but arriving honestly. Grief not just for a mother she'd lost twice, once to leaving and once to a story that had erased the reasons why, but for the 20 years she'd spent unconsciously building her own life around not becoming the woman everyone had warned her not to be. "I think I stayed with Marcus longer than I should have, partly because of her," she admitted, sitting at my workbench, turning a scrap of leftover buckram over in her hands the way she turned most things when a conversation had gotten heavier than the room around it. Some part of me was terrified of becoming the woman who leaves and gets called unstable for it. I didn't want to prove the family story right. I didn't understand, until about 10 minutes ago, that the family story was never actually about her instability. It was about everyone else's comfort. "You're not her," I said. "You're not even repeating her story. You're the one who finally gets to finish it." She looked at me for a long moment, something working itself loose behind her eyes, and didn't say anything else that night about it, and I understood that some truths need time to actually land instead of being answered right away, the same way a spine needs time under the press before you can trust it's actually going to hold. I thought about my own mother that night too, after Elise had gone home, about the version of my father she'd chosen not to hand me, and I understood, for the first time, that families don't just pass down silence out of cruelty. Sometimes they pass it down out of a genuine, if misguided, kind of love, an attempt to protect the next generation from a weight they don't think anyone should have to carry twice. I didn't think that made it right, exactly, but I understood it a little better than I had a month earlier, and understanding it made it easier to forgive both my mother and myself for all the years neither of us had known how to say the harder, truer version out loud. Marcus made his final appearance 3 weeks later at a mediation meeting I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near. Standing in the parking lot afterward when Elise came out alone, her lawyer already walking toward his own car in the opposite direction. I was there because Elise had asked me to be, this time, sitting in my truck across the lot. Not hovering, just present, the exact balance she'd asked for back on her front steps. She'd told me the night before that mediation was supposed to be the last real hurdle, that if it went well, the rest would be paperwork and waiting, and if it didn't, she was bracing herself for another few months of exactly the kind of grinding, exhausting delay Marcus had been threatening since the letter first arrived at my house. I'd offered to wait somewhere closer than my truck. She'd said the truck was close enough, that having me visible but not standing directly beside her felt like the right amount of support for a room where she needed to be the one doing the talking. It was a small thing, her being able to name exactly what kind of presence she needed instead of just accepting whatever I offered, and I understood, sitting there in my truck, that it was also the clearest evidence yet of how much had actually changed in her since June, not because of anything I'd done, but because she'd finally been given enough room to remember she was allowed to ask. I watched her go in around 10 that morning, and I watched the clock on my dashboard longer than I want to admit, and when she finally came out just past noon, her face gave nothing away at first, the careful, composed expression of someone who has learned, over many years, not to let her face announce anything before she's decided what she wants it to say. I got out when I saw him approach her. I want to be honest that I didn't run this time, didn't climb any fences. I walked, steady, unhurried, the way you walk toward something you've already decided you're not going to flinch away from. I signed the papers, Marcus said, before either of us could say anything, holding up a folder like it was a peace offering instead of a surrender. You can stop looking at me like I'm about to do something. I'm not. I'm done. He looked between the two of us, something almost like exhaustion in his own face now, a version of the same tiredness I'd seen in Elise so many times that summer. You want to know something? I actually believed, right up until about a month ago, that I was the reasonable one in all this, that she left because she got bored, because something easier came along, because 14 years of building a life together apparently meant less to her than it did to me. He laughed, short, no humor in it at all. I've had a lot of time to sit with that story since. It's a lot harder to keep believing it once you actually watch someone else be kind to her and see how she responds to kindness instead of control. Turns out that was never who she was. It was just who I made her small enough to become. Nobody said anything for a moment. Elise didn't reach for him, didn't soften, but something in her shoulders eased slightly, the particular ease of a person finally hearing an apology arrive 14 years late and still, somehow, worth something. That doesn't undo any of it, she said, quiet, steady. I know, Marcus said. I'm not asking it to. I just needed to say it somewhere you could actually hear it, instead of somewhere I could keep telling myself a version I liked better. He held the folder out to her lawyer instead of to her, turned, and walked to his car without looking back, and this time, when he pulled away, there was nothing careful or unhurried about it at all, just a man finally leaving a story he'd spent too long insisting he was the hero of. I stood there a moment after his car turned out of the lot, thinking about the driveway conversation back in June, the careful stillness in his posture that I'd mistaken for confidence instead of what it actually was, a man holding a shape together that had already started coming apart underneath. I don't feel much sympathy for him, even now, but I understand him a little better than I did that first afternoon, the way you understand a poorly repaired spine, once you've had it open in your hands long enough to see exactly where the damage started and how far back it went before anyone thought to address it properly. "I want to tell you," Elise cried in that parking lot. She didn't. Not there. She stood very still a long moment, watching his car disappear around the corner. And then she turned to me and let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for 14 years instead of 14 minutes, and said, "Quiet," almost surprised at herself. "I think that's actually it. I think it's actually over." The book came back into it 2 weeks after that, on an evening I'd planned more carefully than I usually plan anything. I'd spent those 2 weeks in my shop after hours, working under the strongest lamp I owned, testing a technique I'd only used twice before in 12 years. A slow, careful application of gentle heat and a solvent gel formulated for exactly this kind of old, stubborn coffee staining, the kind of process that takes hours of patience for a result that isn't guaranteed to work at all. I didn't tell Elise what I was attempting. I didn't want to hand her hope if I couldn't actually deliver on it. I ruined a test page from an unrelated, damaged book before I trusted myself to touch the real thing, watching the ink lift too fast, under too much solvent, blurring past legibility in a way that would have been unforgivable on a page that mattered. I slowed down after that, cut the solvent with more water than the manual recommended, worked in patches no bigger than a fingernail at a time, checking under the lamp after every single pass. Diego found me there past 10 one night, and instead of asking what I was doing, he just pulled up a second stool and sat with me in silence for the better part of an hour. The way you sit with someone doing something that matters too much to interrupt with conversation. It worked, mostly, not perfectly. Some of the ink had faded past any recovery no matter what solvent touched it, but enough came back, faint, brown-edged, legible if you already knew roughly what you were looking for, that I could finally read most of a name that had been hidden under coffee for longer than Elise had been alive. I sat back from the lamp when I first saw the letters resolve, my hands still for the first time in hours, and felt something I don't often let myself feel about a repair. A kind of quiet, private pride that had nothing to do with craftsmanship and everything to do with what the result would mean to somebody else. Margaret, and beneath it, smaller, in the same hand, 3 more words that had survived the stain better than the name itself had, words that read, "Once I'd worked them clear, for my girl, always." I brought it to her on a Friday evening, the same day of the week everything had broken open on that porch a month earlier, and set it on her kitchen table instead of my workbench, open to the front page, and watched her read it the way you watch someone read something you already know is going to change the shape of a room. She didn't say anything for a long time. She ran her thumb over the recovered ink the same way she'd traced the crack in the spine back in June, the same unconscious, private gesture. Except this time there was nothing left to hide underneath it, nothing left unsaid between her fingers and the page. "For my girl, always," she read out loud, quiet, like she needed to hear it in her own voice to believe it was really there. I spent 20 years thinking she left because something in her broke. I never once let myself imagine she might have left because something in her finally healed enough to leave safely. "Maybe it was both," I said. "I don't think those two things cancel each other out. I think sometimes the healing is what finally makes the leaving possible." She looked up at me then, and I understood I was looking at the actual end of a story that had started with sunscreen on a fence line, and the actual beginning of one that neither of us had a name for yet, and that some of the best things a person restores in a life aren't objects at all. Sometimes it's just the plain, ordinary courage to stay in a room once it's finally safe enough to be worth staying in. Elise called Josephine that same week and asked her, for the first time in either of their lives, to tell her everything she remembered about her mother. Not the family's shorthand version. All of it, the good and the complicated and the parts that didn't fit neatly into either. Josephine came over for dinner the following Sunday, the two of them at Elise's kitchen table until nearly midnight, going through old photographs Josephine had kept in a box of her own for 30 years, and I sat in the next room with a book I wasn't really reading, close enough to be present if either of them needed me, far enough to let it be theirs. Mrs. Alcott took to calling the whole summer. Once it was over, the year the fence finally came down, even though the actual fence was still standing exactly where it had always stood, chest high, unremarkable, the kind of boundary that had somehow become less a barrier and more a place where two people had learned, slowly, to keep meeting each other halfway. I still have my copy of that first paperback's twin, a duplicate edition I found for myself a few months later just so I'd have something on my own shelf that matched the one on hers. I don't open it often, I don't need to. Some repairs you carry with you whether the object is in your hands or not, the same way Elise's mother's handwriting lives in her now, whether the book is open on the table or closed on a shelf across the room. Sometimes the thing you spend your whole life learning to fix, quietly, carefully, without ever asking anything back, turns out to be practice for the one moment somebody finally needs you to stop fixing and just stay. Have you ever found out, much later, that a story you'd been told about someone you loved wasn't the whole truth, and that the missing piece changed everything you thought you understood about them? Tell me about it in the comments. I read everyone. If this story found something true in you, leave a like. It helps more than you'd think. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe and turn on the bell. I'll see you in the next one.